Well, Nigeria's inflation rate jumped to 33.2% in March of 2024 compared to February of 2024 headline inflation rate, which was 31.7%. This is despite the reports of the Naira's rebound. And that's according to the National Bureau of Statistics, NBS's Consumer Price Index report released on Monday. The inflation report by the NBS followed the hike of Nigeria's interest rate from 22.75% to 24.75% by the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN. NBS also said there is a rise in staple foods such as yam, garri, rice, beans, and uncooked fermented food, which are under the bread and cereal class. For this conversation, let's now turn to the director at the SCAP Management, Esili Eigbe, and he'll discuss the hyperinflation and Naira rebounds and why the strength of the currency is not reflecting on a fall in prices of goods. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Great. So help us make sense, since you're the expert here. What is the disconnect when it comes to the currency supposedly strengthening, but we're not seeing any drop when it comes to price levels of food?
Well, for starters, much of the appreciation in the currency didn't happen to the latter part of March. So there's no way it could have impacted inflation levels. I mean, we're talking about the last few days when the bulk of that appreciation in March happened. And we're seeing that extend into April. I would add that, it's common knowledge that quite a significant part of the inflation we're seeing in food, particularly, which represents more than 50% of the, this is food now and beverages, represent more than 50% of the, the food basket, the inflation basket. That in particular has also been influenced largely by insecurity. And we haven't seen that abate. If at all, I'll say it's even worsened. So I think that has been a more major contributor. And I'd argue that we wouldn't see that impact till perhaps, in May, June, when, retailers, manufacturers begin to restock inventory, when they've spent existing inventory, which they obviously acquired when the currency was much higher, and then replenishing, at levels when the currency obviously had appreciated significantly. Having said that, I still think that inflation will be very difficult to manage, as I said on the last time I was on your show, on Arise, and that's simply because inflation in Nigeria today is entrenched. People have come to expect inflation, and so it's natural that in sort of pricing goods or hiring staff, you're expecting that that person, for example, would demand more, or that you're going to be paying more for such goods. And so when you're charging customers for a product or service, you're incorporating inflation in that. And to give an example, what would you say your favorite drink is?
Water.
Water.
Yes.
Exactly. That's a very good example, actually. So the guys who are producing water use generators and all kinds of filters that require chemicals, all of which have seen quite a notable increase in, prices attributable to, again, partly security, the FX situation. But very important to note that even though you've seen price increases over, the recent months, they haven't fully accounted for, the deterioration in their financial position as a result of the weaker currency. And what typically happens is that there's usually an 18 to 24 months cycle of raising prices. Obviously, you don't want to move prices all at once because you don't want to disrupt demand for your products. So you have like this 18, 24 months of raising prices. So what I'm saying is that we do expect those price increases to continue over the course of the next 18 to 24 months. So to be honest with you, inflation will remain a problem. And that's without even speaking about services, the cost of services. That will also go up because it lags, tends to lag. There is an imminent increase in minimum wage coming, for example, right? We can all agree as well that electricity costs, the cost of petrol will also go up. So this idea that because we've seen an appreciation in the currency, it immediately equates to perhaps a significant decline in inflation, I think is quite false. Central bank and the fiscal authorities have a lot of work to do. This is only the start of the work they began a few months ago.
Okay, well, while we're still on the back of the exchange rate, and, you know, I think you've done a great job of elaborating the fact that it's almost apples and oranges if we can't focus on the exchange rate and expect to see a miracle with inflation. But a lot of people are talking about price stickiness and people's lack of confidence in the fact that this strategy to defend the Naira in the way it's being rolled out is sustainable, especially to those whose businesses are impacted by foreign currency. What's your take on that?
I think it's a reality, and I wouldn't say that I'm in a position to know exactly what the central bank is thinking in sort of defending the currency the way they have. It's not entirely abnormal, by the way. I mean, if a central bank of any country feels confident about the position of the currency, they usually do try to defend it.
Is it a good solution for Nigeria, though?
It might. Like I said, I don't know exactly what central banks think. They might see things differently from the way that I do.
Not for it.
I.e., for example, they might be seeing significant commitments or promises for inflows from PFIs, portfolio investors, and perhaps that's what's giving them the confidence to do that. But regardless, it does send a very strong signal to the market, So I'd imagine that the bulk of the panic we had a few months ago has probably come off a lot. Obviously people are still very concerned about the economy and what will happen with the currency. I'm not going to lie to you that we've come off so much, some 30%-ish from the height of the weakness. Doesn't necessarily mean that trajectory will continue. It's all dependent on what the central bank and fiscal authorities do from here on. I would advise that the central bank needs to maintain its current hawkish position, and would have argued that in the last meeting, they could have raised the MPR by an additional 200 basis points, so total of 400 basis points instead of 2. And that is because, there's still a lot of risk, downside risk, let me say, to, Nigeria's current economy, our current position. And I mean, we're talking about, on the external side, significant, geopolitical risk. We might well be looking at the beginning of World War III. We don't know yet, but it is possible. We have quite an expansionary fiscal position at the moment. A lot of that's been driven by subsidies on petrol, electricity, which I believe at some point during the course of the year has to come off. So these are all things I believe the central bank needs to weigh. To your point, and that's where we have to discuss the reserves. The reserves, in my opinion, aren't robust enough. We're talking about perhaps less than 4 months import cover. So it's possible they see something, they've gotten commitments that I'm not aware about. But yes, I mean, just looking at it from the outside, it does raise concerns.
And of course, you've stated numerous factors that also contribute to inflation, whether it's cost of services and all the other important points that you mentioned. But when it comes to exploitation, those who are profiting from the way the things are going right now, would you like to see intervention by the government or regulatory bodies that could actually help us see, what we're seeing in terms of the appreciation of the Naira trickling down to something that's meaningful when it comes to purchasing power?
It's already meaningful as it is. I mean, I would appreciate some 30%, but I wouldn't recommend any. The thing about some of those initiatives, sometimes they can turn out to be draconian, and I think rub investors, households the wrong way, and so I'll be careful around that, because I'm suspecting what you're probably talking about is, how perhaps invading some of the...
Not necessarily an invasion.
No, no.
It doesn't need to be an invasion.
No, but perhaps taking over, some of domiciliary accounts,
or,
people who are hoarding...
prices and whatnot.
You mean price controls? In
that regard, yes.
Again, that's a very dangerous path to go. If you're saying price controls, no. We're in an environment where I think a lot of corporates have suffered. It's wrong to assume that everybody is trying to cash out on the situation. I can assure you that majority are not. You only have a few unscrupulous people who are taking advantage of the situation, okay? And so if you want to apply that blanket, sort of initiative or strategy, tactic on the whole market, then you defeat...
What if we go by what we saw a few days ago with the banding system? Like you said, it's not everybody that's profiting from this. There's a select few.
Yeah.
Where, for instance, you have the select few that's supposed to pay the increased tariff of, I believe it's 225 naira.
Yes.
So if those are identified, and then and it's not necessarily a blanket situation.
But how do you do that? How do you identify?
That's why you're here.
Yeah.
Is it possible?
It'll be difficult. I mean, if you're saying, how do you do that? We have a broad base, both SMEs, large corporates. How do you start targeting? How do you know that they're fixing prices? What agency takes that burden of trying to enforce, tracking, enforcing that? So look, let's not talk about it. It's an area that we don't want to go. I think that will generate or yield a lot more from a lot of the policies that the central bank is currently, executing. And like I said, the fiscal authorities also need to really step up. They need to consolidate, cut back on debt, cut back on the subsidies. And to your point on subsidy, because I know people say, look, subsidies are helping to significantly, manage the inflation. I agree. But I'm saying that, the subsidies should not be broad-based. Like you pointed out, we can target specifically band A, band B, possibly even band C, and so the most vulnerable guys would be in D and E, and I think that would be the best approach. Similarly with, things like, petrol will be difficult, but I think the government has been experimenting with direct transfer, and rather than perhaps subsidizing at the pump, you have direct transfers to families to subsidize a few products or transportation. And, the market price of fuel is then what it is.
Okay, very quickly before we go, I just want to bring this conversation down to a very fundamental level, layman's terms. What should the average Nigerian citizen be demanding from the government? Because, I think one thing we've unearthed is that the CBN position and the government position, the fiscal position, seem to be pulling in different directions at the moment. What are the demands that a Nigerian citizen should make so that prices can come down? Do we need, should Nigerian citizens be saying, reduce the size of your cabinet? What are those practical steps, just a few, that can just get us a few steps in the right direction? Because
like I said,
right now people only care how much it costs to put curry in their plate.
Like I said, you need to consolidate. There's obviously talk about consolidating the ministries, government agencies, etc. That will go a long way to cutting costs. And the president himself has announced a couple of initiatives, within his presidency as well, to get that going. But usually the challenge with that, as I see it, would be, in the execution. Sometimes I find that it's always good, to talk about this, or easy to talk about them, but implementing them can be very difficult. We can, like I talked about subsidy, it's important because I'll argue that subsidy has been the biggest drain for the federal government since the beginning of this administration. The subsidies on fuel since inauguration has been larger than the predecessor, much larger than, especially given that he came in on that platform of completely removing petroleum subsidies. So taking that out, cutting back on the debt, using some of those gains obviously to cut back on debt, restructuring existing debt. We talked about, for example, approaching the IMF to structure a deal that allows it to pay back some of its perhaps commercial debt, and then you take on more sort of developmental debt, which are much with much lesser interest rates. Those are, I think a good way for the current administration to start to ease a lot of the burden that we're currently having. After all, we're already taking much of the pain, if not the whole pain already, right?
Listen, we always reduce this pain because it's a little bit too shocking.
These are some of the compromises that are typical when you're taking those kind of developmental loans. So why not just approach them, take your, I don't know, $20, $30 billion loan, commit to a broad-based developmental plan, and let's get cracking on that very quickly. Let's bring together all the different initiatives that are happening at different ministries and agencies, which today isn't really clear. Everyone seems to be working in silos, and even beyond that, let's even assume that there's a way that all those ministries, the agencies do coordinate at the end of the day. How does the guy on the street really plug into that? How do investors know what's going on so that they also plug in and everyone's really coordinating so that we maximize the benefit of that developmental plan?
You've definitely maximized your time here, and we appreciate you, of course. Director, ESCAP Management, Esili Eigbe, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your insight with us. Thank you.